October 1932. Signing, New York. A 47-year-old black numbers kingpin from Harlem stepped through the iron gates of Sing Sing Correctional Facility to begin a 15-year sentence for narcotics conspiracy. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The underworld knew him as Bumpy. He controlled an estimated 40% of Harlem's illegal lottery revenue, more than $300,000 annually in Depression-era money. Prison officials expected him to fade into the general population, another aging mobster stripped of power. Within 24 hours, Bumpy Johnson had rewritten the social order of one of America's most notorious maximum security prisons. He didn't use a riot. He didn't bribe guards. He used calculated violence, strategic alliances, and a reputation that traveled faster than any prison rumor. By the time the evening count was called on his second night inside, the yard belonged to him. This is the story of how one man turned confinement into coronation, and how the power dynamics of an entire prison system shifted in a single day. This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, widely circulated memoirs from former inmates and guards, and biographical accounts of Johnson's life. Some details, particularly regarding private conversations and the precise sequence of events within the prison walls, vary across sources. Where accounts conflict, we present the most commonly reported version and note the uncertainty. Bumpy Johnson arrived at Sing Sing on a Thursday morning in a transport van with 11 other convicted felons. The intake process was standard: strip search, delousing, medical exam, gray uniform, cell assignment. Block C, Tier 3, Cell 17. A 6-by-9-foot cage with a cot, a sink, and a toilet. Johnson said nothing during processing. Guards noted his calm demeanor. One officer later recalled that Johnson moved like a man checking into a hotel he'd visited before. By noon, he was escorted to the dining hall for lunch. Sing Sing in 1932 housed roughly 1,800 men. The population was racially divided and violently territorial. White inmates, many affiliated with Italian and Irish mobs from Manhattan and Brooklyn, controlled the best jobs, the black market cigarette trade, and the prime real estate in the yard. Black inmates were a minority, roughly 15% of the population, and occupied the lowest rungs of the prison hierarchy. They ate last, worked the worst details, and avoided confrontation. Johnson walked into the dining hall at 12:20 p.m. He took a tray and moved toward an empty section of a long table near the center of the room. Before he could sit, a white inmate named Vincent Colucci stepped into his path. Colucci was a mid-level enforcer for a Brooklyn crew serving time for armed robbery. He had a reputation for targeting new arrivals. Witnesses reported that Colucci smiled and said something to the effect of, "You're in the wrong section." Johnson set his tray down. Colucci shoved him hard in the chest. What happened next lasted fewer than 10 seconds. Johnson stepped inside Colucci's reach, drove his forehead into the man's nose, and followed with 2 short, brutal punches to the ribs and throat. Colucci collapsed, choking and bleeding. Johnson picked up his tray, stepped over the body, and sat down at the same table. He began eating. Guards rushed in. Johnson offered no resistance. He was placed in solitary confinement within minutes. Prison rules were clear. Any inmate involved in a violent altercation received automatic punishment. Johnson spent the next 18 hours in the box, a windowless isolation cell in the basement. He was released the following morning at 10 population. By then, the story of the dining hall confrontation had circulated through every cell block. Colucci had been taken to the infirmary with a broken nose and fractured ribs. He would not return to the yard for 2 weeks. Johnson's message was unmistakable. He was not intimidated, he would not be pushed, and he was willing to accept punishment to establish dominance. Former inmates later described the incident as a teaching moment. Johnson had calculated the cost and decided it was worth paying. One guard who worked Sing Sing for 23 years said in a 1960s interview, "Most guys come in and try to lay low. Bumpy came in and threw a grenade." He wanted everyone to know who he was before lights out. Friday, 10:15 a.m. Johnson exits solitary confinement. He is escorted back to Block C. Inmates watch from cell doorways. No one speaks. Johnson walks slowly, scanning faces. A corrections officer later recalled that Johnson looked like he was taking inventory. Friday, 11:00 a.m., recreation yard. Johnson steps outside for the first time since the fight. The yard is a concrete rectangle surrounded by 30-foot walls. Roughly 200 men are present. White inmates cluster near the north wall, where the sun hits longest. Black inmates occupy the southeast corner, farthest from the guards. Johnson walks toward the black section. 3 men stand as he approaches. One of them is a Harlem native named Marcus Briggs, serving 8 years for assault. Briggs recognizes Johnson immediately. They speak briefly. Witnesses could not hear the conversation, but body language suggested deference from Briggs. Friday, 12:30 p.m. lunch. Johnson enters the dining hall and sits at the same table where he fought Colucci. No one challenges him. He eats alone. Guards are visibly tense, expecting retaliation. None comes. Friday, 2 Precura. Johnson is assigned to the license plate workshop, a large industrial building where inmates stamp metal plates for New York State vehicles. The workshop is loud, hot, and dangerous. Injuries are common. Johnson is placed at a stamping press alongside 2 white inmates from the Bronx. One of them, a man named Sal DiCarlo, has ties to the Luciano family. DiCarlo watches Johnson but says nothing. Friday, 3:15 p.m., a work accident. A stamping press malfunctions, sending a metal plate flying across the room. It strikes an inmate in the leg, causing a deep gash. Guards respond. Production halts. During the chaos, Johnson approaches DiCarlo. They exchange words. An inmate working nearby later reported that Johnson said something like, "I know who you work for. I worked with them on the outside. We don't have a problem unless you make one." DiCarlo reportedly nodded. Friday, 5:00 p.m. dinner. Johnson sits with Marcus Briggs and 2 other black inmates. They speak in low voices. A guard walking past overhead the word of protection mentioned multiple times. After the meal, Briggs moves through the dining hall and speaks briefly with several white inmates, including an Irish convict named Patrick Rooney. Rooney is known as a mediator, someone who brokers deals between factions to prevent violence. Friday, 7:30 p.m. evening recreation. Johnson stands near the center of the yard, visible to all groups. Briggs and 3 other black inmates form a loose perimeter around him. Across the yard, Rooney speaks with a cluster of white inmates. Eyes move between the 2 groups. Tension is palpable. A corrections officer stationed in the tower later said the yard felt like a powder keg. No violence occurs. Friday night, Dodd. Inmates return to cells. Johnson sits on his cot, back against the wall, eyes on the bars. A cellmate, a young Puerto Rican man serving time for burglary, asks Johnson how he plans to survive 15 years. Johnson reportedly answered, "I'm not surviving. I'm running this place. Saturday, 6:00 a.m. breakfast." Johnson enters the dining hall. He is met by Marcus Briggs, who introduces him to 2 Italian inmates, Sal DiCarlo and another man named Tommy Abruzzi. The 4 sit together. This is unprecedented. Racial lines in Sing Sing are rigid. Cross-factional alliances are rare and dangerous. Guards observe but do not intervene. The conversation lasts 12 minutes. Saturday, 10:00 a.m. yard time. Johnson stands at the center. Black inmates now occupy a larger section of the yard, extending into previously contested territory near the weight benches. White inmates do not challenge the shift. Patrick Rooney is seen speaking with both Johnson and a white faction leader. An agreement has clearly been reached, though the details remain unclear. Former inmates later described it as a non-aggression pact with economic terms. Saturday, 12:00 p.m., the workshop. Johnson works the stamping press without incident. During a 10-minute break, DiCarlo offers Johnson a cigarette. They smoke together. A small gesture, but its meaning is enormous. DiCarlo's mob connections have endorsed Johnson's presence. The message spreads through the prison within hours. Saturday, 4:00 p.m., a test. A white inmate named Eddie Kern, unaffiliated with any major crew, confronts one of Johnson's allies in the yard. Kern is drunk on hooch smuggled from the kitchen. He shoves the man and raises his fists. Before a fight begins, Johnson steps forward. He does not touch Kern. He simply stands between them, staring. Kern hesitates. 2 white inmates pull him away. The moment ends without blood. Saturday, 6:00 p.m. dinner. Johnson sits at the head of a long table with a mixed group. 3 black inmates, 2 Italians, 1 Irish convict. They laugh. They share food. They are building an alliance that transcends the old racial order. Across the room, other inmates watch in silence. The power structure of Sing Sing has fundamentally changed in 24 hours. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. His family moved to Harlem in 1919, part of the Great Migration. Harlem in the 1920s was a powder keg of opportunity and vice. Prohibition created a black market worth millions. Italian mobs controlled liquor distribution downtown. In Harlem, black entrepreneurs built their own networks. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery, became the economic engine of the neighborhood. Players bet nickels and dimes on 3-digit combinations. Winning tickets paid out at 600 to 1 odds. The house took roughly 40%. It was a game built on hope and mathematics. Johnson entered the racket as a teenager working as a runner. He was smart, ruthless, and unafraid of violence. By his mid-20s, he was managing a small territory in West Harlem. Free. By 30, he was a lieutenant under Stephanie St. Clair, a black woman known as a Queenie who controlled a significant portion of Harlem's numbers operations. Johnson earned his nickname, Bumpy, due to a large noticeable bump on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury. The Italian mobs wanted Harlem. In the late 1920s, they began muzzling into the numbers racket, using violence and political connections to squeeze out black operators. Johnson became St. Clair's enforcer, back with calculated brutality, ambushes, beatings, targeted killings. Freddie, he understood that reputation was currency. Fear was leverage. By 1930, Johnson had earned respect from both black operators and Italian mobsters. He was seen as a man who could negotiate but would never back down. In 1932, federal authorities arrested Johnson on narcotics conspiracy charges. The case was thin, built on the testimony of a single informant. Many believed it was politically motivated, a way to remove a powerful black figure from Harlem streets. Johnson was convicted and sentenced to 15 years at Sing Sing. At 47, he faced the possibility of dying in prison. Instead, he saw it as a new territory to conquer. Sing Sing Correctional Facility opened in 1826 on the banks of the Hudson River in Ossining, New York. By the 1930s, it was one of America's most infamous prisons. It housed murderers, mobsters, rapists, and thieves. Overcrowding was chronic. Cells designed for one man held 2. Violence was daily. Guards were understaffed and underpaid. Corruption was systemic. The inmate population was hierarchical and tribal. White inmates, particularly those with mob connections, controlled the internal economy. They ran gambling rings, smuggled contraband, bribed guards, and distributed the best jobs. Italian crews from New York's 5 families had members inside. Irish gangs from Hell's Kitchen sent their soldiers to Sing Sing. Jewish mobsters from the Lower East Side did time there. These men maintained their outside connections. They received money, cigarettes, and protection from powerful patrons. Black inmates had no such infrastructure. Most were poor, disconnected from organized crime, and vulnerable. They were assigned the worst work details: laundry, kitchen waste, coal shoveling. They were targets for extortion and assault. Guards offered little protection. Racial violence was common and often ignored. But Sing Sing was also a marketplace. A single cigarette could buy information. A full pack could buy protection. A carton could buy silence. Here's how the system worked. Supply chains. Cigarettes, alcohol, narcotics, and food entered the prison through 3 routes. Guards smuggled items in exchange for cash payments delivered to their families on the outside. Visitors smuggled items during supervised meetings, passing contraband during brief physical contact. Trustees inmates with outside work privileges brought items back from work sites. Obviously, each route required coordination and trust. Distribution networks. Once inside, contraband moved through inmate networks. A guard smuggled cigarettes to a trusted inmate. That inmate sold to faction leaders at a markup. Faction leaders distributed to their crews at another markup. By the time cigarettes reached individual inmates, prices had tripled. A pack that cost 15 cents on the street sold for 45 cents in prison, paid in favors, future debts, or other contraband. Protection rackets. Weaker inmates paid stronger inmates for safety. The price was typically 2 cigarettes per week, equivalent to roughly 30 cents. In a population of 1,800, if even 500 inmates paid protection, that generated 1,000 cigarettes weekly, about $15, or roughly $300 in today's money. Over a year, that's $15,000 in modern value. The enforcers who collected these payments took a cut. The faction leaders who organized the system took the rest. Gambling. Inmates bet on everything. Card games, dice, sporting events reported in newspapers, even cockroach races. Bookmakers took a 10% commission. A successful bookmaker could generate 50 cigarettes weekly in profit, equivalent to $7.50 or $150 today. High-stakes games involved entire cartons, sometimes representing debts worth hundreds of dollars on the outside. Labor leverage. Certain jobs were valuable. Kitchen workers stole food. Workshop trustees smuggled tools that could be fashioned into weapons. Laundry workers smuggled clothing. Inmates paid for these jobs with cigarettes or by cutting the worker into their enterprises. A kitchen worker could earn 10 cigarettes weekly just by stealing extra bread and meat. Debt enforcement. When inmates couldn't pay debts, they paid with labor or violence. A debtor might be forced to attack a rival on behalf of his creditor, or to smuggle contraband, or to take the blame for another inmate's infraction. This created chains of obligation and leverage that extended across the entire population. Johnson entered this system with two critical advantages. First, his Harlem connections meant he could facilitate smuggling operations that others could not. Guards who wanted to make money on the outside knew Johnson could arrange payments through his networks. Second, his reputation meant he could enforce debts without constant violence. When Johnson vouched for someone, it meant something. When he declared someone untouchable, people listened. Within 24 hours, Johnson had positioned himself as the central node in multiple networks. He mediated between black and white factions, reducing violence and increasing efficiency. He connected corrupt guards with reliable Harlem operatives. Quote, he offered protection to vulnerable inmates in exchange for labor and loyalty. Most importantly, he created a system where cooperation was more profitable than conflict. A former Sing Sing inmate interviewed in the 1970s described it this way. Bumpy didn't take over by beating everyone up. He took over by making everyone richer. The Italians made more money with him than without him. The guards made more money. Even the black guys who worked for him made more money. He built a corporation, not a gang. By the end of his first day, Johnson wasn't just surviving. He was the CEO. Prison officials were aware of Johnson's rapid ascent, but their response was limited. Warden Lewis Laws, who ran Sing Sing from 1920 to 1941, was a progressive reformer who believed in rehabilitation over punishment. He introduced educational programs, improved living conditions, and reduced the use of solitary confinement. But he also understood that maintaining order in a facility housing 1,800 violent men required compromises. Laws and his staff operated on a principle of controlled chaos. As long as violence remained below a certain threshold and major riots were avoided, they tolerated the inmate power structure. They knew about the cigarette economy. They knew about the gambling rings. They knew about the protection rackets. Some guards participated. Most looked the other way. The alternative, attempting to crush every illicit activity, would have required constant lockdowns, mass solitary confinement, and an inevitable explosion of violence. Johnson's rise actually made Law's job easier. Before Johnson, the racial divide in Sing Sing was a constant source of tension. Assaults between white and black inmates were frequent. Johnson's cross-racial coalition reduced that violence. By creating a power-sharing arrangement, he gave white inmates a reason not to target black inmates. He also gave black inmates a structure and leadership, reducing desperation-driven attacks. A 1934 report from the New York State Department of Corrections noted that violence at Sing Sing declined slightly in late 1932 and early 1933. The report did not mention Johnson by name, but former guards later attributed the drop to his stabilizing influence. One corrections officer said in a 1968 interview, "We didn't like Bumpy because he was a criminal. But we didn't hate him because he kept the peace. There are worse things than a smart convict running the yard. Still, authorities remained wary. Johnson was monitored closely. Guards filed regular reports on his movements, associations, and activities. He was periodically transferred between cell blocks to disrupt his network. He spent additional time in solitary confinement for minor infractions, punishment that seemed disproportionate but served to remind him that official power still existed. Outside the prison, reactions were mixed. In Harlem, Johnson's imprisonment was seen as an injustice by many. He was viewed as a community figure who provided employment, settled disputes, and stood up to white mobsters trying to exploit black neighborhoods. News of his quick dominance inside Sing Sing reinforced his legend. Stories circulated in speakeasies and barbershops. He became a folk hero, a symbol of black resilience and intelligence in a system designed to crush both. White newspapers largely ignored Johnson. When they mentioned him at all, it was as a Harlem racketeer or a numbers boss. His race and his crimes made him invisible to mainstream readers. But within the underworld, black and white, his reputation soared. Mobsters on the outside took notice. If Johnson could command respect in Sing Sing, he could command it anywhere. By the end of 1932, Johnson was the most powerful inmate in one of America's toughest prisons. He had turned a 15-year sentence into a platform, and he had done it in 24 hours. Johnson's coalition fractures under pressure from prison authorities or rival inmates. A younger, more violent inmate challenges his leadership. A guard cracks down on smuggling operations, cutting off his economic leverage. His Harlem connections weaken as his absence stretches into years. Without resources and reputation, Johnson loses control of the yard. He retreats into survival mode, spending the rest of his sentence in relative obscurity. Why it's plausible. Prison power is fragile. Leadership depends on constant reinforcement. Johnson is aging. Younger inmates are hungrier. A single mistake, a failed deal, a public humiliation could unravel everything. What it costs. Johnson's legend dies. Harlem forgets him. He becomes another old convict, invisible and irrelevant. When he's released, he has nothing to return to. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement. Johnson consolidates power and reaches a long-term understanding with prison officials. He becomes an unofficial mediator, helping guards maintain order in exchange for privileges and reduced scrutiny. Warden Laws writes in a private memo to the State Corrections Commissioner, "We are witnessing a shift in inmate organization that may prove irreversible. Traditional control mechanisms are less effective. We must adapt or face escalating unrest."